Welcome, everyone. Hello and welcome back to My EdSpace Key Stage 5 English. Welcome to everyone joining us today. Welcome, welcome. Who have we got in the chat today? If you can see me and hear me, put pluses or put a hi, hello into the chat so that I know you can hear me. And we're going to get started in just a moment, just waiting for people to hop onto the call if they're rushing home from school. Today our theme is going to be jealousy, arguably the biggest theme of the play. And its trajectory really does speak to who Othello is, as well as the consequences of jealousy in all its forms, which we will take a look at momentarily. Hello to everyone just joining. Nice to see you. Happy Friday. Okay. So, in the interest of time, we are going to get started. If this is your first time joining us, this is part of My EdSpace's free streams for Key Stage 5 English. We are taking a look at Shakespeare's Othello. If this is your first time joining us, there are 7 other completely free hour-and-a-half streams that you can watch and follow along with at any point. They are all there to help you improve and broaden and deepen your knowledge of Othello in order to support you in your study if you're doing this for A-level or beyond in university, because it's going to introduce you to more than what you necessarily have time for in class, and will help you to think with a little bit more nuance, hopefully, and a little bit more perspective about Othello and the thoughts about it that have been happening and being published and spoken about for the last 400 years. So, jealousy. First, this is me. If this is your first time joining again, I'm Eleanor. I'm one of the teachers at My EdSpace. I've taught Key Stage 5 for nearly 6 years now, and this course is applicable to anyone if they're AQA, EdExcel or university already, because it is not tied to any one exam specification, but rather just more about the text and about the complexities of the text. So let's get started with some review. Pop into the chat what you have here for your answers if this is your first time or you're just looking through these as a way to review. Feel free to put what you know or to put any questions you may have on the chat as well. Firstly, what could be considered Othello's hamartia? Hamartia meaning their fatal flaw that leads to their downfall. Secondly, how does Iago make Othello jealous? So the ways, their modes of manipulation, etc. Thirdly, how is Othello affected by jealousy? And fourthly, who else is affected by jealousy in the play? Because though we think about jealousy as Othello's hamartia perhaps, we can also think about other characters as motivated by, affected by, or linked to consequences of jealousy. And then the proof Iago provides of Desdemona's infidelity. So I'm waiting for people to pop into the chat, but let's get started with a couple of my ideas just so that your brains are in the most refreshed way possible before we get into these lines of argument in this discussion of jealousy. So firstly, what could be considered Othello's hamartia? We could say it is jealousy, that he is too easily jealous. He, of course, says he's not, as many people who are jealous say that they're actually not. But arguably he is, right? He is married for less than 2 days, and in those 2 days manages, through very slight provocation and very little proof, to be totally consumed by jealousy and go from a loving, devoted husband to a murderous, jealous coxcomb, as Emilia calls him, and then to a dead and murderous monster, as many of the characters call him. So jealousy, or the flip side of jealousy, which is insecurity, right? This idea of jealousy having a further, jealousy being the effect of a previous failing, which is insecurity. Othello, we can argue as well, is insecure and possibly has a right to be, based on the way other characters treat him as an other, as a monster, as not accepted in Venetian society. So perhaps this jealousy stems from insecurities further back in his experience and his treatment. How does Iago make Othello jealous? Well, a couple of different ways here. He firstly compares Desdemona and her betrayal of her father, so-called, as potentially indicative of a propensity to jealousy. What do I mean by that? Indicative, an indicator of a propensity to jealousy, or would be a predilection or a tendency towards jealousy, towards betrayal. So in the same way we could say that Othello has a propensity towards jealousy, perhaps Desdemona has a propensity towards betrayal or deception, right? Because we have her having deceived her father successfully and deceived all of Venice seemingly successfully, and Iago and Brabantio warn Othello that she could betray Othello as well if she managed to get away with doing it to her own father. We could also say that he pits Othello and Cassio against each other. Cassio, Othello's best friend and recently promoted lieutenant. But Othello is an outsider, and Cassio is the perfect, consummate gentleman. This is loved and desired by Venetian society, particularly the women. He is courteous and relatively flirtatious and is also handsome. And Othello is immediately described in Act 1 as monstrous, right? As ugly, as villainous. So for him to be pitted against his best friend and the love for each other to be drawn into suspicion by Iago's machinations, then this is that double betrayal that we spoke about in our previous lesson about Cassio, Brabantio, and Roderigo, where Shakespeare plays on this idea of double betrayal, not just betrayal of your best friend towards you, but also betrayal of your best friend by being involved with the woman you love or your wife. So both of the closest people to you betraying you together is that idea. We could also say he preys on Othello's insecurities. If Othello believes he's not good enough for Desdemona, or that he cannot confide or trust Desdemona, then all Othello has to be led to believe is that these insecurities are real, and Iago provokes this in him by mere suggestion. Similarly, with another way is through this construction of these scenes. We've called Iago a director, particularly Harold Bloom, the critic, calls him this. And Iago is a director in a way because he creates these mini scenes that he then shows to Othello of something that is innocent, like Cassio and Desdemona speaking to each other, but imbues it with this sense of suspicion, so that even though Othello is looking at something innocent, he suspects it as something nefarious. This construction of these scenes and manipulation, whilst provoking Othello, but also this idea of proof. So he offers proof to Othello, and we'll get into this in a moment. This idea that he is the one who is drawing Othello's attention to these seemingly dangerous or traitorous presentations here. How is Othello affected by jealousy? It isolates him, first of all. He doesn't know who to trust, certainly not his wife, and certainly not his best friend. It affects him physically. He falls into what we would call an epileptic fit out of pure disturbance of his mind. He is mentally confused. By that I mean he is not making sense. His language is incoherent. He also becomes physically violent. He becomes imbalanced, and by that I mean he's unable to moderate his emotions. He sort of bursts into these crazed questions or these fits of violence or incoherent speech. And he becomes, from being a trusting and loving husband, he becomes suspicious and cruel. And then he becomes monstrous. And I put quotations around this, firstly because this is the way that it's described in the play as monstrous, so I'm quoting, but secondly because it's tough to say who the monster is here, if it's Othello who is monstrous, or if it is Iago or society that has made Othello act this way, or if it's them who's monstrous. For example, Iago who's monstrous because he's this devil-like satanic influence on Othello, which brings him low. Who else is affected by jealousy in the play? Well, we've got Iago, who seemingly cites jealousy as one of the reasons for getting revenge on Othello, because he says that this revenge is partly to do with his fear that Othello and Iago's wife Emilia have had an affair. It also perhaps could be some kind of sexual jealousy. So in Cinthio's original version of this, before Shakespeare's, the play of Shakespeare's was previously this short story, and in it the ensign, or the Iago character, is actually in love with Desdemona and is furious that the Othello character has married her. It's seen as a betrayal. In a different interpretation or a different translation, it's more constructed as Iago falls in love with her after the marriage, but is driven by jealousy to destroy Othello and have Desdemona for his own. This is one interpretation of Iago again. We could also say that Iago is jealous of Cassio, possibly because Cassio is promoted unfairly and has a closer relationship with Othello. And also possibly he's sexually jealous of Cassio, either because Cassio is this seeming ladies' man, or because Iago secretly or subconsciously actually wants Othello for his own, romantically or sexually. So with that, we'll be looking at a queer theory interpretation of Iago's character, that he's motivated by this love that he cannot express or have in society. But it is all in that interpretation, and different critics offer different interpretations of that. We could also say that possibly Brabantio is jealous in this play. Brabantio is Desdemona's father, and when we're thinking about jealousy, it's not that he wants Desdemona to his own as his wife, obviously, but he wants to keep her under his control. So as a possession, which is, as we've seen in our previous lesson, clearly an idea of Brabantio's, that he wants to possess Desdemona, he wants to have her, and he wants to control her up to and including the point of her sexuality. He wants that to be in his domain and sort of determine those choices for her, because that's the measure of control that he, as a father in Venice, is expected to have. So he jealously keeps her and jealously tries to keep her in her guardage, i.e. in his protection. So he wants to keep her to her own, and he's destroyed by this fear of Desdemona's sexuality as being out of control in her marriage to Othello. We could also say Roderigo is jealous. Roderigo is the lovesick and clownish other suitor of Desdemona, who we see, who is hopelessly in love with her. We never see him and Desdemona really interact, so there's not much we can judge on based other than the fact that Iago, Roderigo himself, and Brabantio all know that Roderigo has failed in this and that Desdemona has clearly married someone else, clearly loves someone else. But Roderigo can't get over this. The first lines of the play belong to him, as he is furious about this marriage and wants to steal Desdemona back. And that is how he is able to be inculcated by Iago into such schemes, because he is sold these schemes as an opportunity to steal Desdemona away. So again, we have that idea of possessiveness, right? He is jealous of Othello, and that's why he goes along with this plot to destroy him. Roderigo is also jealous of Cassio, per Iago's manipulation, because he says, well, that would be the person who, if anyone was to steal her away, it would be him, which is the way he gets Roderigo to start a fight with Cassio and attempt to kill Cassio. Of course, Roderigo is actually killed and Cassio survives, but that's part of this as well. We can also say Bianca. Bianca is the woman who is in love with Cassio. She's so in love with him that she follows him to Cyprus from Venice. It's implied that she's a sex worker. It's unclear as to whether she is or not. We do relatively easily infer from the play that she and Cassio do have some kind of sexual or physical relationship. And it is, in a way, Bianca on whom the play hinges, because it is she who finds the handkerchief in Cassio's room, and that interaction between her and Cassio with this handkerchief is all seen by Othello. Othello, knowing that the handkerchief is actually Desdemona's, that he gave her, and in wondering why it is in Cassio's room, it is Bianca who says, well, one of your other hobby horses or one of your others lovers or sex workers with which you're engaged, this is hers and I shouldn't have to do this work on it. Cassio asks her to copy the embroidery pattern onto another handkerchief because he likes it. But it's Bianca who sort of throws it back into his face and says, I was a fool to accept that. Absolutely not. Do it yourself. And it's here, really, that's the catalyst for the ending of the play, as Othello sees this handkerchief being exchanged, puts supposedly the pieces together, and then makes his plan to kill Cassio and Desdemona in revenge. Then, what is the proof Iago provides of Desdemona's infidelity? This is the handkerchief. Handkerchief. This is the handkerchief, also known as the napkin. Both of these quotations. This white handkerchief spotted with strawberries is the ocular proof. What does Othello mean by that? The ocular proof. This is the visual proof of Desdemona's infidelity. We've seen in our study of Desdemona, as well as gender, as well as with Bianca and Cassio, this idea of the value of the handkerchief being a symbol of Desdemona's virginity and sexuality. And as Newman says, a critic who we've cited several times in our previous lessons, it was considered equivalent to or a sign of infidelity or adultery for a woman to give a man who's not her husband a handkerchief, because it was an intimate object, right? It was in a way like a kind of underwear, right? It's something that's used to dab one's mouth or sweat, etc. In such conservative and physically restrictive and restrained times, that was sufficient as giving this love token, this token of intimacy to someone who's not your husband would be proof. It's this idea of modesty, a modesty garment being exchanged. Now, just to start off with, possibly the most famous quotation from Othello, and it captures quite a lot of what we're thinking about with jealousy in the play. This is Iago fittingly saying this. "Oh, beware, my lord, of jealousy. It is the green-eyed monster which doth mock the meat it feeds on." What does this mean? Firstly, this idea of warning about jealousy here, this being a warning of the power and particularly the destructive power of jealousy here. To us, of course, this is ironic because this is Iago speaking, who is doing this on purpose, right? He is provoking Othello's jealousy whilst commenting that it would be dangerous to be jealous. So it's almost like that saying unsaid idea of Iago saying, "Oh, well, don't be jealous, whilst putting this idea, placing this language into Othello's head. Beware, my lord, of jealousy. Immediately as well, we have this idea of foreshadowing. Here. Because in this warning, which is ironic, we have kind of the rest of the play. This downward spiral. M11, yeah, like hypocrite, I would say definitely. Yeah, because it's Iago, and Iago is a hypocrite, right? But also, it's also this idea of dramatic irony, right? Of us being aware here of what's going to happen, and thus Iago being extremely intentional here as well, right? If he is presenting jealousy as this harmful thing, knowing the destructive power of jealousy and making Othello jealous anyway, it's this kind of devilish temptation towards jealousy, right? Manipulative, 100%, M11. Of course, it is the green-eyed monster which doth mock the meat it feeds on. Okay, so much here to talk about. Firstly, this green-eyed monster, which you may have encountered outside of Othello and might not even realize that this was an idea from Othello, because it is that idea that you're taught when you're little of this green-eyed monster of jealousy. Firstly, so immediately we have this link between jealousy and monstrosity. First of all, because this is the trajectory of the play. Jealousy to monstrosity. And that is interesting, right? Because really, Iago and a lot of the other Venetians, like Brabantio, suggest that Othello is a monster from the beginning. Brabantio, for example, says that he has enchanted Desdemona with these chains of magic and is somehow abusing his power over her. But really, this is then suggesting that Othello isn't monstrous inherently. It's this idea of jealousy planted in his head, or this jealousy provoked within him, that is monstrous. And we can see as well, if we're going to say that Iago is jealous, that it's also Iago that becomes monstrous, right? He goes from honest Iago to that viper and that villain. The same with Rodrigo, who is a wealthy and silly but seemingly relatively harmless suitor in Venice at the beginning, and is destroyed by the end as well, is killed and linked with this villainy as well. The same with Brabantio, right? Attempting to keep something so jealously guarded that it destroys him when he is lost. Hi Kishore, thank you for joining. But not only do we have this idea of monstrosity, of loss of humanity here, which is really what this means, right? And links us to these ideas presented by Lumba when we were looking at race, of jealousy, as well as, and all of these negative characteristics associated with Othello are not indicative of any one race, just like all of the positive characteristics, like Othello's nobility and his language and his love are also not as a result of his race, or are not only inherent to his race, but are the domain of all races, right? Viper meaning a viper type of snake. M11. Yes, this idea of he becomes this like venomous, poisonous snake. Then as well, this idea of a green-eyed monster. Green-eyed. Why this detail? Well, perhaps because green at this time is associated with disease and sickness. Though you may automatically associate green with things like recycling or nature, perhaps that we could also talk about nature here, as in it's the natural consequence of jealousy. Or perhaps it's this idea of disease, right? Of jealousy being this diseased monster that takes over you and acts like a sickness, right? It corrupts like a sickness. Or it perhaps kills you like a sickness. We can also think of green as this linked with ideas of poison, right? So again, this contaminant or this killer. That corrodes Othello's humanity. But also, if we're thinking about this green-eyed, this really does link to this idea of vision in the play, which is arguably a big theme in the play as well. This idea of vision and sight. So jealousy then as something that clouds one's vision. And thus, if it's clouding your vision, your interpretation. Oops, interpretation, getting too excited, writing too quickly. Interpretation of reality and of the truth. It's this kind of lens through which one's vision is altered. So someone like Othello, who previously was so logical, so reasonable, was so sturdy in the face of doubt, is now affected, is seeing everything through this lens of jealousy. So as we were saying, these seemingly suspicious scenes that are actually completely innocent, but it's this lens that is metaphorically coloring them with this fog of jealousy, right? So it's influencing everything. He cannot see the truth. So when he says, give me the ocular proof, he's asking for visual proof, but he can't see what's right in front of him. He can't see that Desdemona and Cassio are innocent. All he can see is his suspicion. His suspicion is clouding his vision and thus clouding his judgment. M11. The green-eyed monster phrase invented by Shakespeare. Yes. So, yeah, this idea about someone being envious. Envious and jealousy are a little bit distinct, but I think you could say they work for both here. Yeah. And then we're thinking about this last piece here. What doth mock the meat it feeds on. So not only does this monster destroy you, it also makes one a laughing stock. It makes you ridiculous or farcical. That meaning silly and stupid, right? So it's almost, I wouldn't say it's funny, but it's almost comical how quickly Othello is transformed from one to another, right? From well-respected, loving husband and general to monstrous villain. So it's going to make fun of you whilst it feeds on you. Who is this meat? Othello, right? And interesting calling Othello meat because this already suggests this idea of him being dead, right? This idea of him being carrion, something for people to come and pick away at, right? So this foreshadowing then of the consequences of this monster being the meat, being the matter on which it's feeding. So jealousy then is something that takes over you and consumes you. So then we think of jealousy as something that controls you, right? In both ways, not just this idea of it consuming you physically in this metaphor of it being meat, a monster that feeds on meat, but also this idea of it consuming you in the idea of it controlling you, taking you over. Now, is Othello the only victim of jealousy? No. So it's also making a mockery of Desdemona, of Rodrigo, of Brabantio, of Iago, of Emilia, of Cassio to a certain extent, right? It's this idea of the destruction that jealousy causes, and it only gets stronger the more it's fed, right? So this idea of it getting out of control. 11, doth is Old English there perhaps, which does. Doth means does in this instance. So it is a little bit old-fashioned by Shakespeare's time, but still in relatively common use. Okay, so how does jealousy then appear in the play? It is something that is monstrous, first of all. It is something that is all-consuming. It is like a poison that corrodes or corrupts one's humanity. It is possessive and a form of control. It is an indicator of insecurity. It is not only all-consuming, but destructive, right? It perhaps is the catalyst of the play. It certainly seems to drive the trajectory of the play. It is, if we're thinking about it as this green-eyed monster, it's blinding, right? Transformative in a bad way, M11, yeah. So we can definitely add that. You could say as well destructive, if we're thinking about it totally destroys someone. Yeah. It also, if we're thinking about this, it has victims, right? So people like Othello who have insecurities, but also people who are innocent, right? Particularly women, right? Like Desdemona is a victim of jealousy. Could we say that it is something that's inherent? As in, it's something people are born with. Some people are more naturally jealous than others, and perhaps Othello is jealous in some way. Absolutely. Absolutely, we could. What kinds of jealousy exist? Sexual jealousy? Friend jealousy? Irrational jealousy? Right? Specifically, if we're thinking about characters, we want to talk about Othello. We want to talk about Iago. We could talk about Brabantio, Cassio, and Bianca. So there's quite a lot to talk about with this. If you're thinking about how to organize yourself in terms of preparing for a piece of work or preparing an essay to practice, then we want to think about these as different lines of argument that we can focus on for a paragraph and then move on and talk about elsewhere. So for example, talking about it as blinding, with all that imagery of vision that's in the play. Separately from talking about it as monstrous. That's not to say not making links between, but thinking about it as monstrous with all that monstrous imagery, that devilish imagery, Othello becoming unlike himself in one, This idea of blinding, not being able to see the truth, the proof, the handkerchief, etc., would be in another paragraph. As I said, who's jealous in the play? These are quotations that encapsulate each character's relationship with jealousy. These are the people who are jealous in the play. So Othello's we've spoken about. That is how jealousy affects Othello. Iago, I hate them all, and it is thought abroad that twixt my sheets he has done my office. I know not if it be true, but I, for mere suspicion in that kind, will do as if for surety. So it seems like this is cause and effect. Arguably it isn't, because arguably Iago is motiveless, as Coleridge says. But we can certainly think of this as perhaps a reason of Iago's for getting revenge. And because he is suspicious, which he says he is, jealousy and suspicion then being linked, and then action with jealousy. So this idea of action and reaction with jealousy. And this idea of sort of justification, my jealousy of this, even if it's not actually true, it's sufficient for me to act in violence. Rodrigo as well, revealing so much about his character when he says, what a full fortune does the thick lips owe if he can carry it thus. We spoke about this in our last lesson when we spoke about Rodrigo in depth. But firstly, this is him saying what a great deal Othello has if he can get away with it. This full fortune, Desdemona. And this racialized epithet is Othello, if he can get away with it. So this reveals quite a lot about Rodrigo, because firstly, his racism and prejudice here in the way he speaks about Othello. In the same scene, he's saying he'd rather be Othello's hangman than follow him. So this dehumanization of Othello from the beginning, but also this dehumanization of Desdemona, right? Rodrigo is very overtly and graphically sexual in his language whilst talking about Othello and Desdemona. And perhaps that's out of sexual jealousy, but we can also see the effect it has on the presentation of women here. How he views Desdemona once he cannot have her is only as this full fortune that he can get away with. And so thus this one of the secondary consequences of jealousy is this dehumanization, especially of women, this violence against women in this language. Brabantio also says, this accident is not unlike my dream, belief of it oppresses me already. So this is when Rodrigo and Iago say that Desdemona's run away, and Brabantio says, this isn't unlike my dream, well, this is like my dream. Me believing in it oppresses me already. So firstly, why is he dreaming that his daughter's going to run away with them all? Right? This suggests some kind of jealousy, whether that's subliminal and this is some sort of incestuous jealousy, or if it is this idea of fear of losing control of one's possessions, which to him Desdemona would be. And this idea of the immediate effect, right? Belief of it. This is about a dream and possibly a dream coming true. And this idea of oppresses me already. We can see the physical and mental effects of jealousy here. And this makes sense because this leads to Brabantio's death off stage as he's destroyed by this grief. And Bianca says, throw your vile guesses. This is actually, Cassio speaking to Bianca. Throw your vile guesses in the devil's teeth from whence you have them. You are jealous now that this is from some mistress, some remembrance. So Cassio is saying, throw your jealousy, your accusations to the devil. That's where you got them from. So, okay, immediately, then the devil is the cause of jealousy, right? It's the devil's provocation. What does that imply to us? That implies that Iago is a devil because he promotes and manipulates jealousy in people. But also that this is the devilish work. Jealousy is being evil. It's being a sign of corruption or temptation. And he's saying, get rid of it, right? You are jealous now. This is from some mistress. When this is talking, this is the exchange of the handkerchief as well. So this idea of jealousy with this proof that not only is sufficient for Othello to act, but also sufficient for Bianca to act as well, in saying, this is proof that you're unfaithful to me, so be done with you. And interestingly, this is the only time when someone is told that they are jealous to their face. So unlike Iago with this beware, my lord of jealousy, he's not saying you are jealous, knock it off. He's saying, ooh, be careful you don't go into jealousy. So in that way is kind of a much more manipulative and insidious character than Cassio, who says, stop acting jealous and grow up. You think this is from someone else. Don't worry about it. So this idea of jealousy as vile guesses, and this idea of uncertainty and evil linked with jealousy that we don't see in the other characters who are so willing to be jealous. Yes, M11, you could say, is jealous or envious. Yeah, so this idea of jealousy being jealousy of your own things as well as other people's, but envious being you wanting what someone else has. You could argue both. You could probably say Iago is more envious than jealous, but there's so much kind of grey between the two that I would take either. Now, what activates jealousy? Insecurity in Iago and Othello's mind, certainly. Anxieties about reputation and status, right? This idea of particularly Othello's precarity in his fear of being lost and exiled and shunned from Venetian society. So he jealously keeps his reputation, and thus his jealousy, because he's afraid of losing his position, is much more easily provoked by any insinuation. Also this idea of competition, right, particularly between the male characters. So there quite frequently have been questions that come up with masculinity or male friendship in questions on Othello. And this idea of who loves who more. And perhaps this being why Iago is initiating his revenge on Othello. But also perhaps this idea of competition of being able to, between men, of being able to control their women in this patriarchal Jacobean way. Questions of ownership as well, yes, and possession. Who has the right, the ability, the power, the masculinity to control and own and dominate what they own? Also this idea of appearance. Othello being very sensitive about his appearance, himself saying that perhaps this is why she's gone, is because he couldn't keep her. But also this idea of Desdemona's beauty being such social currency that Othello's possession of it is important to him as well. We could also think about appearance as the appearance versus reality, right? So something that seems suspicious that actually isn't. As M11 said, yeah, possessiveness, 100%. Discomfort with comfort and security as well. So this idea that Othello feels he can't keep Desdemona, as well as the handkerchief is used as ocular proof. So another instance of appearance, because that smallest suggestion, as Iago calls it, a trifle light as air, can activate jealousy. How did Shakespeare's audience view jealousy? Well, Varchi, in the Blazon of Jealousy in 1615, which is slightly after this was published, but certainly encapsulates the ideas of the time, it goes on to list the qualities in a woman that might make her especially rare and therefore provocative of jealous desire. Not alone in respect she is well-bred, is pitiful of nature, proper of personage, constant, witty, discreet, modest, of few words, tender of her own reputation and honour. That seems like spelling mistakes in there, but it's actually just the lack of conventionality regarding spelling and grammar in the Jacobean era. So what this is suggesting is that these women, the women who are well-bred and good and socially successful and fulfilling of all these strident gender expectations for Jacobean women, are particularly rare and thus much more likely to be a cause of jealousy, because they're so good and so rare that people have to be careful they don't lose them, right? They have to guard them jealously. And the same for Edmund Tilney's The Flower of Friendship, also quoted by Reed. The Flower of Friendship, published in 1593. So, for example, sexual jealousy is explicitly described as the desire for exclusive possession. The Stoic philosophers say that jealousy is a certain care of man's mind, lest, and that should be lest, but it's pronounced spelled least here, lest another should possess the thing which he alone would enjoy. So, though this isn't explicitly talking about gender in The Flower of Friendship, this does suggest that there is a time, that during the time, this idea of possession, of exclusive possession, would be a reason for jealousy as well. So then women and their role in this is this object of pride and reputation that needs to be guarded jealously, or else someone else will possess it, will have it, and thus it will lose its value and the enjoyment will not be shared the same way. So let's take a look at some exam questions about jealousy then. So firstly, of course, there'll be one directly on jealousy, the theme of jealousy. Secondly, though, you could think about this as an part of the argument about the relationship between Othello and Desdemona is of one of jealousy or possessiveness or control, or similarly thinking about the consequences of jealousy within their relationship, this idea of total destruction, right? As well, you could think about this as the disturbing aspects of human nature, jealousy being one of those disturbing aspects. There is quite frequently a question on something to do with humanity, human nature, the natural qualities someone possesses, or this idea of the disturbing, the terrible, the horrible, etc., and corruption, how someone's mind can change, transformation, those kinds of themes, in which you can think about jealousy as a disturbing element, right? You could also think about insecurity, racism, fear, right, has been a recent question for Othello as well. But fear of what? Fear that your wife is going to be taken away, fear that you've been betrayed, fear of you not having control over your wife and thus over your reputation. And then as well, the theme of love, right? And this applies particularly to those doing the AQA question here, because your question most commonly fits into that paper about love and relationships. So this idea of love, it doesn't just have to be all the good things about love, right? It can also think about love and jealousy and their interaction, also the consequences of jealousy within a romantic relationship, or what jealousy does to love. And now let's look at some arguments the way we have done in previous lessons, where we think about this collection of quotes and this line of argument in the top in blue, as well as in the blue box above me, some critical quotations, so quotations from critics across the spectrum of criticism, thinking about how we can use these in tandem to argue something about jealousy. So firstly, seemingly the clear one, Iago's manipulation of Othello's jealousy is the catalyst and driving agent of the play. So when you're thinking about this argument, you want to think about, in the construction of your essay, either going in different paragraphs from beginning to ending, sort of tracking the different configurations of jealousy across the play. But you also want to think about the fact within each paragraph of tracking this presentation across the play. So if this is the catalyst and driving agent, then we have to look definitely at the beginning and how this jealousy is initiated and developed within Othello, but also its ramifications, right? Its consequences. And Levin says social pressure as well, like maybe it's shame, disregard, 100%. Yeah. Okay, so Iago firstly says, the Moor is of an open and a free and open nature that thinks men honest that but seem to be so, and will as tenderly be led by the nose as asses are. So this idea of Othello being trusting, thinks people are honest, so seemingly isn't jealous, right? Thinks people honest, but immediately as well, this danger of that seem to be so. So Iago knows from the beginning that Othello believes the superficial presentation of women, of people, what people appear to be rather than what they are. And this idea as well of him being tenderly led by the nose. So this idea of him being influenced like a farm animal, right? And particularly who would have a ring in their nose or a muzzle. So this idea of control, silencing, direction and guidance. So this idea of strings and attachment and control that does continue through the play and the motif. Similarly, it's Iago who says, she did deceive her father marrying you, and when she seemed to shake and fear your look, she loved them most. So Iago then planting the seeds of jealousy here in Othello's mind by saying, she did deceive her father, and when she seemed to be afraid of you, she actually loved you the most. So she can get away with seeming something she's not. So here then we have these two quotations interacting so well with this idea of seeming and appearance here. And Iago directing Othello's gaze here and leading him into a certain interpretation. And we can see Othello's immediacy at beginning to believe him, right? He is doing this. He is being led here and is unquestioning here. And this is only very briefly after that first initial resistance. He believes Iago when he says this. And so Iago is proved to have known what Othello is like. Similarly, Iago says, trifles light as air are to the jealous confirmations strong as proof of Holy Writ. So he's saying tiny insignificant things, as light as air, are to jealous people equivalent to proof, biblical proof. What is this trifle he speaks of? These appearances and suggestions, but what trifle in particular? The handkerchief. Right? That is a trifle light as air, but to Othello is this confirmation as clearly as if he was going to walk in on him and Desdemona, on Cassio and Desdemona. So the handkerchief then is crucial to Iago's manipulation. Well, you can also see with Iago this idea of I'll pour this pestilence into his ear, this idea of pestilence, disease, right? And the fact that he is pouring it into his ear. Thus, manipulation, jealousy becoming this disease, and Iago being its source. So that motif of poison that carries on with the more already changes with my poison, this poison being this manipulation again, this corruption of Othello, and this driving the action of the play, as we can see it carries on. And Othello, yes, M11, plague, exactly. Othello says, will you, I pray, demand that demi-devil why he hath thus ensnared my soul and body? So too with the motif of poison, there's this motif of entrapment, right? This idea of snaring and trapping being linked to this idea of control here and guidance. That he can pull and trap and create this net for Othello. As G.K. Hunter says, Othello becomes a tragedy of the loss of faith. So this is what Iago leads Othello to do, is lose faith in Desdemona, in what he sees, in what he believes, in the people that he loves, etc. Neil also says Iago drives Othello to question his own manhood, indeed his very humanity, by making him doubt whether he has power over his own wife. So this shows then Iago's importance in the play, as he is the person who leads Othello into this questioning, because he thinks he can't have power over his own wife. Omer and De Verona says that Iago uses suspicion, hints, affirms by denying, covers his traces, forestalls criticism, and blurs the contours of reality. So good a quotation to talk about Iago's influence and linking it with that green-eyed monster idea of him clouding Othello's vision, guiding his vision. And then Iachnen as well, Iago can seduce the eye and mind. This idea of Iago then as a seductor, and seduces Othello into his way of seeing and thinking things, directing his gaze, as we said. Similarly, we can also think of jealousy as binding, and these are maybe some of the quotations we'd use to prove that, because Othello here loses his rationality and his ability to see due to jealousy. Interestingly, Iago warns him about this. I am not what I am. This is at the beginning. And as we spoke about in our Iago lesson, this flip and reversal of a biblical phrase that both Jesus says as well as is quoted earlier in the Bible as well, of this I am what you say I am, or I am what I am, or the name of God translating in the Old Testament to the great I am. So then Iago being someone who is not the same and admitting this as he appears to be. So this idea of honest Iago then in juxtaposition to the fact that he says he is not what he is. Don't trust me, in other words. And again, this idea of trifles and proofs of Holy Writ becoming the same to the jealous, that they can confuse something insignificant with something completely proven and true. And Iago, again, such a handkerchief, I am sure it was your wife's, did I today see Cassio wipe his beard with? So Othello does not see this happen. Iago tells him this happens, and Othello doesn't question it. And this handkerchief, so drawing this idea of the handkerchief, this handkerchief taking over the vision of the play, literally being the most visible symbol in the play. But Iago just saying these things and planting these images into Othello's mind, so that when he sees Cassio and Desdemona interacting, has this in the front of his mind. And this idea of wiping his beard with is quite a gross image, because there might be sexual innuendo here as well, right? This idea of her virginity, or this token of her affection, this intimate garment of hers, and him wiping his beard with it. It is this idea of sort of contact and touch and physicality that would be really provoking to Othello, and is. Then, of course, we've got the green-eyed monster. As Iago says as well, her eye must be fed. So this idea of these appearances, this jealousy, this idea of people need to be told and shown what they think to be true. right? And people's eyes needing this idea of food, this consumption that also links to this monster. And this idea of food, jealousy taking over one, right? Iago as well, when devils will their blackest sins put on, they do suggest at first with heavenly shows. So again, appearance, this black and white imagery across the play. Devils, when they're doing their worst sins, do it seeming the best. So such a clear link to I am not what I am, right? And also Othello's own doubt that he can't believe she is adulterous if she looks so beautiful. These ideas of Jacobean physiognomy. Iago says, men should be what they seem, or those that be not, would they might seem none. So this idea of seeming, and this is Iago playing with Othello here and saying, I think Cassio seems honest. And in sowing that doubt into Othello's mind, in that not to be able to trust what people look like or act like. So this idea of losing his rationality, being unable to see. Cassio as well, Iago as well saying, nay, yet be wise, yet we see nothing done. She may be honest yet. Tell me about this. Have you not sometimes seen a handkerchief spotted with strawberries in your wife's hand? So immediately we have this almost cinematic zooming in of the action in the play to this hand with the handkerchief in it, and its visual nature as a symbol, the white with the red, as important here, and linking this idea of honesty with this handkerchief and it being proof then of the adultery is really Iago's work here. Othello, with all of this suggestion, villain, be sure thou prove my love a whore. Be sure of it, give me the ocular proof. So this idea that you have to confirm this for me. He is insisting on proof, and in this way seems rational, but then loses this and neglects to actually have the proof. Because in this same scene, it's, oh, blood, blood, blood. This idea of his incoherence, this idea of blood then taking over his vision, this contaminant of this red strawberry imagery, that proof of the loss of virginity being linked with what Othello is seeing, this kind of red screen in front of him, the way people say they see red, that expression. This idea of him being consumed, unable to see anything other than punishment without the proof that he requested. If thou be false, heaven mocked itself, I'll not believe it. So this is when he's saying, I cannot believe that she's not innocent because she looks so innocent. White face, etc. That carries on in the final scene with this put out the light and then put out the light. So turning off the light and taking away her life, but this idea of light imagery and sight in the darkness here being crucial across the play, because though there is light, though they're asking for light, there is darkness. Othello can't see clearly. And then, O ill-starred wench, pale as thy smock, cold even as thy chastity. So we can see that as soon as Othello is shown that Desdemona is innocent, after she's dead, his view then clocks back into rationality again, and he says, I can see your chastity. You're so cold and pale. That paleness being associated with chastity and virginity. And Reid is interesting in talking about the Freudian element to this, or the Freudian interpretation of this jealousy, this competitive or normal projected jealousy and delusional jealousy. Could we argue that Othello is both? Could we argue that Iago is projecting his jealousy onto Othello and onto Desdemona and thus wreaking his own revenge for the own jealousy that he has? Yes. Could we say that Othello's insecurities are projected on Desdemona and this is the cause for his jealousy? Yes. Can we say that this is also delusional jealousy, completely irrational jealousy? Absolutely. We could also say jealousy is corrosive and destroys Othello's humanity. So starting with the fact that he's not jealous when Emilia asks this, and Desmond said, who? He, I think the sun where he was born drew all such humours from him. So the idea that where he grew up, he is not naturally jealous. Perhaps that's because of the sun taking that out of his system, burning it out of his system. So this idea that he is not jealous at the beginning. The same with Iago, saying that he is trusting and he'll be led here, right? And Emilia later saying they're not ever jealous for a cause, but they're jealous for they're jealous. So jealous only for jealousy's sake. And Emilia as well. It is a monster begot upon itself, born upon itself. So begot and born here, the same thing, this idea of spawning upon itself. So jealousy is a thing that continues to develop and is irrational fundamentally. It's not based on anything ever, Emilia is saying. It's only based on its own jealousy and is growing by itself. Iago as well. This idea of jealousy as poison. Dangerous conceits are in their natures poison, at which at the first are scarce found to distaste, but with a little act upon the blood, burn like the mines of sulphur. Not poppy nor mandragora, nor all the drowsy syrups of the world shall ever medicine thee to that sleep sweet which thou odest yesterday. So this saying that poison, sleeping tablets, etc. are corruptive to someone's very humanity, because first you can't even taste them, but then a little bit of them can act on the blood, once they get into your bloodstream, in other words, burn like sulfur mines. Sulfur famously being linked to the fires of hell, right? Hellfire. Interestingly, Othello describes the fires of hell in Act 5, Scene 2. So this idea of his own punishment, him knowing this, being consumed with this jealousy and this hellfire. And this idea of nothing, opium as poppy or mandragora, none of these sleep tonics or drugs to help you sleep will get you back to that sweet sleep, excuse me. So you can never have a medicine that will give you sleep back. Sleep in the Jacobean era being linked with peace, a clear conscience, and innocence. Whereas this idea of jealousy then being something that takes away your peace forever and fundamentally changes you so that you cannot sleep or have peace again, and that no medicine will fix it. It will drag you to these mines of sulfur, so it will take you to hell. So this is such a good quotation to talk about the foreshadowing and the effect that Iago has on Othello. And we can see this because Othello changes from his beautiful language at the beginning to fire and brimstone, goats and monkeys. This is, for the time, quite graphic language, hellish imagery, and this idea of animals that is what Iago speaks like in the beginning, that Othello has now become like. So literally his language is changed. He's imbibed of Iago's way of speaking, and he is transformed into this incoherent mess that sort of curses and swears and growls. As Iago says, you are eaten up with passions. This idea of consumption again, and Othello being this meat that is being both mocked and fed upon. And Othello becoming this monster. I'll chop her into messes. Oh, blood, blood, blood. He becomes animalistic, vicious, predatory here. As Berry says, these characters evoke in the few choice epithets the reigning stereotype of the African on the Elizabethan stage. Othello is black, and his blackness connotes ugliness, treachery, lust, bestiality, and the demonic. So this idea of the characters evoking these stereotypes of blackness and jealousy then destroying Othello's humanity in the way that from where he was this previously noble character, he becomes this stereotype that Iago and Brabantio and Rodrigo present him as in the first place. And Berry also says he's the Moor of Venice. The fact of Othello's alienation is the play's most striking visual effect. This idea of we can see Othello's alienation across the play from being this public figure, literally in public in Act 1, to this totally alone, totally isolated character. Then interestingly as well, if we're thinking about victims, jealousy engenders and appears to validate violence against women. So here, jealousy is enough to allow violence against women here. As Othello says, when he is first given to doubt Desdemona's honesty, says, I had been happy if the general camp, pioneers and all, had tasted her sweet body, had I nothing known. So he would prefer that everyone under his command in the army would have had sex with her, tasted her, he says, than him know about one person doing it. So this speaks to a real violence, right? Of him rather have everyone sort of violating Desdemona than him knowing about one instance of it. And it's immediately for us becomes this fact that Desdemona becomes something to be consumed and something to be violated and taken and tasted here. She is not human immediately. And the fact that he would prefer his loving wife to be this for his army than have some kind of passionate affair with someone, this speaks to violence against women, right? Othello also says to Iago, you've set me on the rack being a torture device here. So even the suggestion of infidelity is enough to have Othello feeling like he is being tortured, right? So then this torture of thinking that Desdemona could be unfaithful is enough to start driving this revenge against her. And Othello also says, thinkst thou I'd make a life of jealousy to follow still the changes of the moon with fresh suspicions? No, to be in once in doubt is once to be resolved. So he's saying, I'm not going to wait and make a life out of jealousy, waiting to see if it's actually true. He's weak as well. He can be manipulated easily. M11, I would say definitely. But this idea of as soon as she is proved adulterous, I'm resolved. That's it. So this idea of being able to immediately act and immediately fall out of love with his wife and be able to destroy her like that really does speak to this normalized violence against women, if this punishment were normal. Othello also speaks to Desdemona saying, O thou weed, who art so lovely fair and smellest so sweet, that the sense aches at thee, would thou hadst ne'er been born. So firstly, he calls her a weed, so a nuisance, something unwanted, something to be ripped out and tossed aside. But also this idea, I wish you were never born, with this doubt immediately. And then chop her into messes, cuckold me. This idea of he'll cut her into pieces for cuckolding him, or even threatening to cuckold him. Then thinking this trajectory getting worse and worse in terms of this violence. Othello in Act 5, Scene 2, saying, yet she must die, else she'll betray more men. So her being then a sacrifice in order to preserve men. Interesting then. And if I quench thee, thou flaming minister, I can again thy former light restore. So Othello then seeing that he has the power to kill her and thus give her her former view, the former view he had of her. So then he feels that violence is both normal, accepted and justified, because if he does so, he'll be able to turn her back into this perfect Desdemona that he loved before. And Desdemona says, I understand a fury in your words, but not the words. So this idea of confusion, right? She doesn't know what's happening, and he doesn't even really explain it to her until the ending. So this power dynamic then, where she's not even able to stand up for herself. Othello downs Strumpet, Strumpet being a swear, a curse against her, calling her a whore would be a synonym. And saying down, like get down on your knees is what he's saying, because he wants her to pray and beg for forgiveness, whilst also telling her he's going to kill her. So this power dynamic then here is really alarming if we're seeing about this violence against women, and Othello viewing this as justified. Othello, after killing her, saying, my wife, what wife? I have no wife. So this idea that he, as soon as this jealousy is supposedly confirmed, he doesn't have a wife anymore. She's dead to him. And thus we can see this idea that better to be dead than to have been adulterous. And when he's justifying this to Emilia and then to the later nobles, he says, Cassio did top her. This is his reason. That's why I killed her. Cassio did top her. Ask thy husband else. Oh, if I were damned beneath all depth in hell, but I did proceed upon just grounds to this extremity. So I was justified in doing this because she had sex with someone else. So this is being completely validated. And then, had she been true, if heaven would make me another such world of one entire and perfect chrysolite, I'll not have sold her for it. So the idea, if she had been faithful and heaven would make me another her, like a gemstone, another perfect gemstone like her, I would have not have sold her for it. So I wouldn't have exchanged her for the most perfect gem in the world. Again, that views her as transactional, though. Said, if she was true, I would have kept her, but her life is in my hands. And as Neil says, given jealousy's association with guardianship, surveillance, and general husbandry, this boundary between household jealousy, fear of losing one's possessions, and sexual sexual jealousy, fear of being cuckolded, was hazy. It was expected a man would be jealous of his property, which would have included his wife or daughter. So this idea then of property is woven through all of these quotations, as we can see. And as Neely said, Desdemona is virtually an afterthought to the analysis of men. Evident so here in Othello's language, clearly. Then we can also think alternatively about Othello as having a jealousy within him that Iago activates but doesn't actually create. So this is in one of Othello's more famous monologues, where he says, this fellow's of exceeding honesty, talking about Iago, and knows all quantities with a learned spirit of human dealings. If I do prove her haggard, though that her jesses were my dear heartstrings, I'd whistle her off and let her down the wind to prey at fortune. So firstly, if she was proved adulterous, even if the string attached to us were my heartstrings, I'd send her off. Happily for I am black and have not those soft parts of conversation that chamberers have, for I am declined into the vale of years. Yet that's not much. She's gone. I am abused, and my relief must be to loathe her. O curse of marriage, that we can call these delicate creatures ours and not their appetites. I'd rather be a toad and live upon the vapour of a dungeon than keep a corner in the thing I love for others' uses. Yet 'tis the plague to great ones, prerogative as they are they less than the base? 'Tis destiny unshunnable like death. Even then this forked plague is fated to us when we do quicken. Look where she comes. If she be false, heaven mocked itself. I'll not believe it. So here, he's saying, probably because I am black and don't have those kind of softer skills of society, of conversation, etc., that other Venetian nobles have, I've lost her. She's gone, I'm abused, and my only relief must be to hate her. That'll be my only consolation. And then he says, curse that we can call our wives ours, but not their appetites. We can't control their sexual appetites, in other words. So again, a propensity to jealousy, this fear of women betraying him. I'd rather be a toad than keep a corner in the thing that I love. So I'd rather be this evil character, evil animal, which would have been a witch's familiar, so definitely evil to the Jacobeans, than to have only part of something that I love. So I don't want to share, in other words, here. Yet is the plague to great ones, and this forked plague is fated to us. So he's saying it's fated to me because I am a noble, great man, for these to be my issues. So I was always going to have this because I'm a great man. Reed says it's Desdemona who gives Othello the anxiety. Because he's afraid of losing her. He has a propensity to be jealous of her. Iago's power is that he represents something that is in Othello. And Iago seeds ideas by implied communication, so he seeds them, but then Othello's own feeling grows. Olson said, jealousy is the state of paranoid suspicion born out of a corrupt inwardness. So there is some fatal flaw in Othello. Perhaps his hamartia is jealousy that is provoked by Iago, but there is this suspicion in Othello inherently. Feldman, quoted in Reed, said, the chaos feared by the Moor can be defined as a madness resulting from a revelation of his inner lack of manliness. So he is afraid he is not enough of a man to keep her. This fear of unvirility or not being a strong, powerful, sexually successful man springs from deeply repressed homosexual impulse manifested by his passion for Cassio. So perhaps he's actually jealous of someone like Cassio, who does have these soft parts of conversation and is not black, who would be able to control Desdemona. And then Stalabras is an acquirer. Othello is totally successful, but as a possessor, he lives with the imminent fear of loss. So he's able to get Desdemona initially, but he cannot keep her. He's afraid of losing her. Similarly, we can think of sexual jealousy as the most powerful and destructive emotion in the play. And this part here talking about Iago and Othello wanting proof. Iago says, would you, the supervisor, grossly gape on, behold her topped? So what, you want to go and see them having sex? That's the proof you need? And look at Othello's reaction immediately. And then Iago says, it were a tedious difficulty, I think, to bring them to that prospect. Damn them then, if ever mortal eyes do see them bolster more than their own. What then? How then? What shall I say? Where's satisfaction? It is impossible you should see this, were they as prime as goats, as hot as monkeys, as salt as wolves in pride, and fools as gross as ignorance made drunk. But yet I say, if imputation and strong circumstances which lead directly to the door of truth will give you satisfaction, you may have it. Othello says, give me a living reason. She's disloyal. I do not like the office, but sith I am entered in this cause thus so far, pricked to it by foolish honesty and love, I will go on. I lay with Cassio lately, and being troubled with a raging tooth, I could not sleep. There are a kind of men who's loose of soul that in their sleeps will mutter their affairs. One of this kind is Cassio. I heard him say, sweet Desdemona, let us be wary, let us hide our loves. Then, sir, would he gripe and wring my hand, cry, oh, sweet creature, and then kiss me hard, as if he plucked up kisses by the roots that grew upon my lips, lay his leg over my thigh, and sigh and kiss, and cry, cursed fate that gave thee to the Moor. And Othello says, oh, monstrous, monstrous. Nay, but this was but his dream. And Othello says, but it denoted a foregone conclusion. So this is really the crux of why Othello is jealous, because Iago is winding him up to visualize his wife having sex with his best friend. And Iago makes this whole sort of scene description of him lying in a bed with Cassio, seemingly in their military encampment in Cyprus, and saying that Cassio in his dreams was trying to kiss Desdemona, but was actually kissing Iago, and thus he has this really clear image of how this would actually happen. And we can see from Othello's reaction, death and damnation, monstrous, monstrous, foregone conclusion. He's believing it. And this is it that makes him actually rage. As Olson says, Desdemona is crucial to our understanding of jealousy in Othello, largely because she's so conspicuously rendered valuable in the play. So this idea that she is desirable is part of this idea of sexual jealousy. Reed says she's more powerful in status than her husband, so perhaps this means that he is more fearful of losing her, as we've said before, because other people desire her. Coleridge says he struggles not to love Desdemona. He claims that Othello is not driven by jealousy, by a moral indignation and regret that Desdemona's virtue has been destroyed. So this idea that he is more angry that Desdemona's virtue has been taken away than by jealousy itself. Reed says his jealousy can best be explained as a mere elementary defense against the castration anxiety aroused by his marriage to Desdemona. So he is afraid of being cuckolded here, which is why he is jealous. In other words, is because of this sexual jealousy in particular. And Traub identifies jealousy as a disruption resulting from the anxieties of a masculinist culture in which women's bodies possess enormous powers of signification. So this idea of Othello not being able to control, possess, dominate Desdemona's body is the reason for his jealousy. Then if we think about Iago's jealousy, this is about Cassio and Othello. Iago says that Cassio loves her, I do well believe it, that she loves him, 'tis apt and of great credit. The more, howbeit, that I endure him not, is of a constant, loving, noble nature, and I dare think he'll prove to Desdemona a most dear husband. Now, I do love her too, not out of absolute lust, though peradventure I stand accountant for as great a sin, but partly led to die at my revenge, for I do suspect the lusty Moor has leaped into my seat, the thought whereof doth, like a poisonous mineral, gnaw at my innards, and nothing can or shall content my soul until I am evened with him, wife for wife. I'll have Michael Cassio on the hip, abuse him to the more in the right garb, for I fear Cassio with my nightcape too. So this idea of jealousy, Cassio and Desdemona love each other. Othello is actually a really good person, and they both love each other. Iago loves Desdemona too, seemingly. He's saying maybe not just out of lust, though he is definitely lustful of her, so perhaps it's a sexual jealousy of his own. But he's also jealous of what he thinks Othello has done, has possibly had sex with Emilia. And this, like a poisonous mineral. So again, we have this idea of poison and jealousy, and he won't stop until he has wife for wife. So until he's exchanged and done the exact same thing that he thinks Othello has done to him. And he also fears Cassio with my nightcape as well. So he's also sexually fearful of Cassio as well as potentially being able to steal Emilia away. Iago again says, I don't know if it's true, but for mere suspicion and surety. So this idea, I can't prove it, but I'm going to act like it's true. Is this just an excuse to get revenge? Maybe. Iago says, I confess it's in my nature's plague to spy into abuses, and oft my jealousy shapes faults that are not. This is him speaking to Othello. And he admits in his own jealousy that he thinks things that are not true are actually true because he's jealous. And he's saying this to Othello, so this is again pretty ironic. And Iago as well says, do not rise yet. This is when they are kneeling in the Act 3, Scene 3. And Othello vows to get revenge. And Iago then kneels as well. Do not rise yet. Witness you ever-burning love's lights above, you elements that clip us round about. Witness here Iago doth give up the execution of his wit, hands, heart to wronged Othello's service. Let him command, and to obey shall be in me remorse, what bloody business ever. So Iago is here kneeling. So people call this the marriage scene because they're kneeling to each other and promising each other that they love each other the way married people do, or Christian marriage during this time. And Othello says, I greet thy love not with vain thanks, but with acceptance bounteous, and will upon the instant put thee to it. So this idea that they love each other here, and thinking about them being this couple, seems like a lot happening there. Read the play a long time ago, I don't remember well. Yeah, so this idea of them perhaps being in this loving relationship, and so many of the questions that come up have to do with Iago and Othello's relationship rather than Othello and Desdemona's. So thinking about this as the actual love of the story, the actual betrayal perhaps of the story as well, or perhaps Iago's jealousy that he can't have Othello. Coleridge believes that Iago has no motives for his desire to destroy Othello, yet he is evil for evil's sake. Could we use Coleridge's point to argue against, right? And say that Iago actually is jealous for several reasons here. And the Freudian interpretation, Iago's pain and distrust is caused by his repressed homosexual desires. That's completely unrequited. So he can't have Othello, so no one can. Hi, Ash, welcome. And Iron Spider, nice to see you guys. Then the final kind of version of jealousy we're going to see is Bianca's jealousy, where she says, and I was going to your lodging, Cassio, what, keep a week away, 7 days and nights, 8 hours, and lovers' absent hours more tedious than the dial 8 times, oh weary reckoning. So here she's saying, why have you been away from me for a week? It's too long. And lovers being apart from each other, it's like 8 times worse than just the normal time. Cassio says, pardon me, Bianca, I have this while with leaden thoughts been pressed, but I shall in a more continuate time strike off this score of absence. Sweet Bianca, handkerchief, take me this work out. Bianca says, oh, Cassio, whence came this? This is some token from a newer friend. To the felt absence I now feel a cause. Is it come to thus? Well, well. He's saying, sorry, I've been busy with harder thoughts. In a better time, I'll make it up to you. Can you take this embroidery out of this handkerchief and copy it for me? She says, where is this from? Is this from someone else you've been spending your time with this week? Well, well. Jealousy. And then Cassio, as we said previously, throw your vile guesses in the devil's teeth. You are jealous now it's from some mistress. No, Bianca. So he's saying it's not from someone else. But we know that Othello watching this can see this and knows it's from Desdemona. Simpson says that Bianca underscores the theme of jealousy. So perhaps in one paragraph you could focus on Bianca and the other minor characters who have jealousy here. And Simpson also says is like Cassio and Othello an outsider. So perhaps jealousy is particularly clear with outsiders because of that insecurity, as with Desdemona. Now, how could we think about this? There are so many different ways we can argue this point. This could be the beginning of a topic sentence or of a thesis statement here in which we encapsulate all our answers. So just to review, here, as Othello's hamartia here, as totally destructive, as the catalyst of the play, as threatening manhood, as possessiveness, as Iago's manipulation, as blinding, as Othello loses his rationality, his ability to see, as corrosive or poisonous and destroying humanity, as engendering and validating violence against women, as an innate quality of Othello's that is inherent to him and only somewhat provoked by Iago, as sexual jealousy is the most destructive emotion in the play, as Iago's jealousy is what drives the play, as Bianca's jealousy encapsulates this theme of jealousy across the play, as it clearly is ubiquitous in the play and is linked to this ocular proof of the handkerchief, or as the handkerchief becomes this symbolic weight of jealousy across the play. And then what can we think about in terms of themes that we can link to jealousy? Human nature, prejudice, race and colour, identity, reputation, power, appearance versus reality, love and relationships, marriage, manhood and honour, womanhood and sexuality, gender. All of these different essay questions you could incorporate one of these ideas at least about jealousy into. So jealousy being part of human nature, or being causing the destruction of human nature, for example. Jealousy is caused by prejudice and insecurity, and then ongoing and ongoing. With reputation, jealousy being a fear of reputation, etc. Apologies for overgoing a little bit. Just wanted to wrap up these final thoughts for you so that you could leave ready to think about how you could incorporate this into your own work. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Nice to see people who have joined from previously. Thank you to M11, Iron Spider, Ash, for contributing to Kishore as well, to contributing in the chat. Appreciate you. M11 adding dominance as another way of talking about perhaps power, or another theme you could talk about. Absolutely. Great contributions. And Scott would not have cared about Othello as much without these lessons. So appreciate that. Glad you are enjoying them. And I look forward to seeing everyone next week for more themes of Othello that we will have on Wednesday at 6:50 to 8:20, and then this time again on Fridays. Thank you all for your contributions and for learning with us today. And until next time, bye.